what I have to talk about this morning is what can we look to in our past, personal past and institutional past, that could help us in these very difficult times in which we live. These are hard times, fraught times. Every day that we open up the newspaper, we don't know what other calamity awaits us. We're not alone in this, but collectively, we could share some of our ideas and many of our feelings and even our plans for what to do for the future. Last week, after the meeting, many of our members stayed here in this room and sat around and shared their feelings about what is going on. It's essential that we do this and that we not isolate ourselves. And as I said, we're not alone in this, of course. There was a letter in the New York Times on the 3rd of February this year from Ms. Davidson. Let me just read part of her letter. She said, "These days, I don't want to get out of bed, turn off the warm shower, read the newspaper, or head out of doors. But I must fight against authoritarianism, racism, sexism, homophobia, inequality, religious intolerance, xenophobia, denial of LGBT rights, war, environmental destruction, and any other manifestation of ignorance and hatred that continue to exist and thrive in our societies." She continues, "I'm 76. I can't do as much as I used to, but I will get up, dry off, read the paper, and head out the door. We must stand up and speak up together now and always." I think that is a wonderful thought for us to keep in mind. And where do we get the courage to stand up? And of course, it doesn't have to be literally standing up. Some of us can't do that so easily. And some of us can't get outdoors as much as we used to. But there are still ways in which we can live that make a difference. So what can we learn from history? Let me start with personal things rather than institutional. I was conceived in 1942, born 8 months later in 1943. What was 1942 like for people who are living in this country? Well, just to highlight a few of these things, many Japanese in this country were in detention camps. In the South Pacific, there was the terrible defeat of the Allied forces at Bataan, one of the great surrenders in American history in the course of a war, followed by a death march in which approximately 15,000 people, soldiers who were captured, died during the march to the concentration camp. It was also the beginning of Nazi extermination camps. That was 1942. I don't know what was in my parents' minds when they decided to have yet another child, but it couldn't have been so pessimistic that they thought that the world was going to end soon, or before I had a chance to grow up and experience my own old age. They had to have at least that much optimism to say, we're going to bring another child into this world. And I think about my parents. What was the world that they experienced up until 1942? My father was born in 1902. My mother was born in 1906. What was the world like between those years and 1942? Here are just some of the highlights. And of course, I'm presenting to you essentially the lowlights, not the highlights. Here are the terrible things that they experienced. One of the first images that I have of my parents when I was growing up was both of them had these scars on their upper arms, round, disfigured kind of things. And I asked them what that was. They were the shots that they got during the 1918 influenza epidemic. And my father told me about remembering that there were doors in his neighborhood. I'm not sure he lived in an apartment house, but single family, two family houses in Flatbush where he lived. Houses had bars across them, tapes across the doors, not letting people in or out. The influenza in the United States in 1917, 1918 was more deadly per capita than COVID has been in the United States. And we could all remember 5 years ago. I'm thinking of Ken sitting back there who was working at one of the metropolitan hospitals where body after body was being brought in. It was terrible times. But the influenza of 1917 per capita was worse. That was my parents' teenage years. They lived through the Depression. During the Depression, 1 out of every 3 American workers was unemployed. As one writer said, when there was not a garbage dump in Chicago, which was not diligently haunted by the hungry. I don't think we've seen that yet. During the 1930s, one of the most influential Americans who had an enormous following on radio was Father Coughlin. And Father Coughlin, it was estimated, had 10 million listeners every week in the 1930s on radio, was a fascist supporter and terrible anti-Semite. Week after week, spewing this poison over the airwaves. Tremendous following. He helped establish the Christian Front, which is the forerunner of white nationalism today, Christian nationalism. Here on Long Island, to make it closer to home, was Camp Siegfried in Suffolk County. In 1938, on George Washington's birthday, I'm sorry, it was during the summer, they had their annual gathering to celebrate German Day, in which 40,000 people came to Camp Siegfried. Now, Camp Siegfried raised Nazi flags, had portraits of Hitler. The kids were indoctrinated, as Nazi youth were in Germany. All the streets were named after Nazi personnel, right here in Suffolk. 40,000 coming for the celebration. In 1939, there was a rally at Madison Square Garden in which 20,000 people came on George Washington's birthday, and Madison Square Garden was filled with these huge portraits of George Washington and Adolf Hitler, in which it was a Nazi rally sponsored by the Bund. And if you might not remember that, perhaps you might recall that 1 or 2 restaurants here in Nassau County and nearby Queens were the centers of Bund activity. People did not hide their Nazi sympathies. people didn't hide their anti-Semitism. That was par for the course. And I remember, to his dying day, my father would not buy a Ford. Why did he not buy a Ford? Because Henry Ford was a terrible anti-Semite, promoter of the Protocols of Zion, this vicious forgery that blames all of the world's economic catastrophes upon Jews. A pamphlet, by the way, that has been resurrected in some circles today in the United States. So that's the time that my parents lived in, before I was conceived. They experienced what we would now think of as trauma, fear, and yet they lived through it. So what I'd like to do is take a look very briefly, of some figures in the ethical movement itself, and what did they have to say? What did they do that might offer us some modicum of inspiration? I want to start, and this is no particular order here, but I want to start with Jerome Nathanson. I'm only going to present people who were alive during my lifetime. So I am not going back to the history of the ethical movement. I'm not going back to Felix Adler in 1876 or the people who founded the other societies. I want to present only people either I had met personally or at least were alive during my lifetime. First is Jerome Nathanson, who died in 1975. And he was one of the two main leaders of the New York Society for Ethical Culture during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. He was an intellect, a passionate intellect, a defender of democracy and freedom. He was the key figure, and his obituary in the New York Times said, when he died and they printed his obituary, that he was probably the person in New York most responsible for the abolition of capital punishment. He also was the author and editor of a number of books which featured John Dewey, and he and John Dewey knew each other very well. John Dewey did participate in many activities at the New York Ethical Society. For those of you who may not be familiar with John Dewey was probably the leading American philosopher, in my view, probably ever. And I think that David Sprinson would agree, and David is one of his acolytes. But John Dewey and Jerome Nathanson did many things together. And Jerome Nathanson had put together an annual conference called Democracy, the Science for Democracy, Conference on the Scientific Spirit and Democratic Faith. I think it lasted for 4 or 5 years or so, I believe right after the Second World War. So here's one of the things that Jerry did. I think him as Jerry. Everybody else who knew him, I think, knew him as Mr. Nathanson, or certainly Jerome, but I had been a colleague of his long enough that Jerry comes to my mind. He wrote the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, which says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." He goes on, Jerome Nathanson goes on to say, is a statement of moral idealism, of ethical aspiration. When we say that it epitomizes the American spirit, we do not mean that these words express what we are as a people. We mean that the aspirations to which they point affect American life and give shape to the American spirit, because they are an inescapable guiding principle of our life. However much we may betray the principle, We can, let me see. However much we betray this principle, we cannot rid ourselves of it without destroying our character as a people in the process. This is what he said in 1958. We aiming at these things. We haven't arrived there. Sometimes we get closer, sometimes we fall further behind. But that's our aspiration. And if we lose it, then we've destroyed our very character. This he said in 1958. McCarthy. Next person I want to point to is Henry Newman, who I did not know. He died a year before I started in the ethical movement. He died in 1966. He was 84 years old. And he was the first leader of the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture and served there for a very long time until his probably early 70s, middle 70s. So approximately 40, 50 years he was at the Brooklyn Society. And he was the leader that changed the very nature of an ethical society. Up until then, it had been a lecture forum and an outlet for social justice activities. What Henry Newman did is that he introduced what we now think of as more of a family-style, congregational nature of a society. He introduced, in other words, the pastoral dimension to ethical culture, which really had not been there before. He was, I learned from people who did know him, and from his daughter, who I met in California when I spoke at the Los Angeles Society one year. She was out there. She had been involved as an actor in Los Angeles. That he was a soft-spoken and very gentle person. During the First World War, he was a conscientious objector, adamantly opposed to the war, as was Felix Adler, but Adler was not a conscientious objector. Henry Newman was also a conscientious objector. During the Second World War, Henry Newman continued to be a conscientious objector. He had a principle. He stood by the principle. He was willing to take whatever opprobrium might have been hurled in his direction. But what I want to point to is an activity of his, which was during the summers when the Japanese were interned in the camps out west in Montana, Idaho, and California. He went out there every summer because he was an English teacher, also at Brooklyn College. And what he did during the summers, he spent his time going from Japanese internment camp to camp, teaching there on a volunteer basis. Here's something that he wrote in 1926. There are depths upon depths in us that we are never aware of until we face unafraid the difficulties we imagine we can never bear. It is marvelous what can be done by courage, which is only strength made conscious of its unused resources. The ethical faith believes that the spirit of humanity, awake and aware of itself, is more than a match for whatever it is called upon to meet. Third person is Alice, mainly known as Nanny Politzer. Nanny Politzer, who died in 1975 at 102. Well, working backwards, you can imagine the life that she experienced. Her activities when she was a young woman was as a suffragist. Now, we don't, to think of suffragists as polite women in, cosseted, whatever they were wearing, that was far more than that. Many of them were on picket lines, protesting, and going to jail. Now, I'm not going to tell you much more about Nanny Politzer, because next week, Ann Clayson, former leader of our society, will be speaking here, and she said that she will be spending quite a bit of time talking about Nanny Politzer. So I will only read an anecdote that involved her. I was never introduced to her, but I know that we were at meetings together and at the New York Society, but no one ever introduced me to Nanny to the best of my recollection. This was a recollection, a reminiscence by Ed Peoples, who was an encamper at the Encampment for Citizenship, a program started by Nanny Politzer, Algernon Black, leader of the New York Society, with the tremendous support of Eleanor Roosevelt. And it brought together young people from across the country and some overseas for a 6-week immersion program in democracy. So here is what Ed Peoples writes about Nanny Politzer. He says, "One memory that really stands out for me was the night of our banquet, that is the end of the 6 weeks for the encampment. This is taking place in Riverdale, the Bronx section of New York City. The podium was near a large glass window behind us that faced the parking lot below. As she stepped up to the podium, we heard repeated shouting and racial epithets from outside. The encampment always was a multi-ethnic, integrated, in every way imaginable program. Then a stone crashed through the window and hit Nanny on the back of the head. Nanny, who was about 86 at that time, pitched forward. She righted herself, ignored what had happened, and went on to give an inspiring talk, urging us to go forth and right the world. When she finished, we all stood up and screamed and clapped. It just turned on the buttons inside of everyone. We thought, I will never retreat from this again. We wanted our commitment to measure up to her example." 1957. And the final person I want to talk about this morning is East Spetter. Some of us who've been around the society long enough can remember Dr. Spetter. Dr. Spetter, who spoke with his Dutch accent, who arrived in the United States in 1950. He died in 2012 at 91. He had been the founding leader, and leader of the Riverdale Ethical Culture Society for many, many years. During the Second World War, he was involved in the Dutch resistance, was captured by the Germans, and spent time in Auschwitz and Buchenwald. He was awarded the Resistance Cross by the government of the Netherlands. And in 1951, he moved to the United States, became a leader of the Riverdale Ethical Culture Society, and served there for over 40 years. Also founder of the mental health clinic in Riverdale, and was a certified psychotherapist. Here's something that he wrote. "I hold deeply that each life is a gift, which the centuries bestow upon the continuity of existence. A passion for humanity is what will negate totalitarianism and oppression. A passion for humanity will open the jail doors of history, provided our mutuality and love outpaces our tools. All of us are constantly closer to death, and yet we are also in touch with the perpetuation of life through what we create and build. The sense of future derived from this position has resulted for me an infusion of insight, which even at moments during my captivity in the concentration camp, when death seemed certain and sealed, did not desert me. So what now? I've given you 4 illustrations of leaders, luminaries in the ethical movement who I've shared time with on this earth. What now? What do we do? What's at stake? We all know. Democracy. But also decency, kindness, truthfulness, and reason. There will be resistance, and some of the resistance will require great courage. And there will also be resistance that will exist in smaller, less visible ways. Some of the resistance may be public and political, and some of it may be intimate and personal. The title of the talk is "The Past is a Foreign Country." They do things differently there. It comes from a novel by L.P. Hartley, which was entitled The Go-Between, published in 1953, which looks back on a life beginning around 1900. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, the opening sentence of the novel. But we don't live in the past. And the future is an unknown country to us. And there, they will do things differently than we do here. What we know for sure is that the future will arrive. And immediately, what we experience now, here, today, will be the past. So it's not what anyone has done in the past that we look to, but it is that they have done something in the past that inspires us. They did things differently there than we need to do today. What the future will be in some measure, big or small, depends upon what we do today. Each of us. Our deeds, big, small, in between, every one of them becomes part of the fabric of forever. We live in hard times, but let it not be for us bitter or angry or anxious or depressed. As Jerome Nathanson said, it's a test of our character. We were warned by our president, who said, "I will be a dictator on the first day in office." He said, "I am your retribution." He said, "He who saves the country is above the law." He has said, "We're just getting started. There will be swift and unrelenting action that will continue." So I think it's reasonable to expect that there will be more cruelty, more corruption, more destruction, more despotism, more lies, and more vengeance. Many will suffer. So how do we resist the temptation to turn away, to give in to exhaustion? It was a couple of weeks ago, I think that it was Judy, as part of her address here, said that many of us have known people who have been brave, who have been heroes, probably not the grand ones that we read about in the newspapers, but the people who are the little heroes, people we have known. and when we stop and think about some of the things that they have done, it's been a remarkable indication of their courage. But we can look to the past, and I want to look to the immediate past, that is last week here at our society, and to thank Linda for having presented an entire morning of poetry. It isn't that poetry exists in one compartment and politics in another. They are all of a piece. I do want to read a poem from William Carlos Williams. Some people consider it to be one of the great American poets of the 20th century, who really spent his days not as a poet, not as an academic, not as an educator, but as a family physician in Rutherford, New Jersey, attending to poor pregnant women at the local hospital. And a poet. He said, "One can't be a poet without knowing about interest and money. It's not human to ignore people." The political, the ethics, and aesthetics were all of a piece. So I want to read this very small part of a much longer poem that he wrote to his wife. He says, "My heart rouses, thinking to bring you news of something that concerns you and concerns many men. Look at what passes for the new. You will not find it there, but in despised poems. It is difficult to get the news from poems. Yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." The New York Times Magazine last Sunday, I believe it was, had a piece that featured Charlie Locke, who said that she begins the day very thoughtfully. She says, "When I catch myself mindlessly reaching for my phone, the poems that she reads every morning, the poems act as a slap on the wrist. Put down that phone. Look up. Instead of defaulting to whatever demands my attention, I move toward a precise and generous beauty." I often think of a line from Emily Dickinson. It's not quite exactly what she had in mind, but I extract this line because I find it useful. And one of her poems, she says, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." I would say, pay attention to what is happening in the political world, but pay attention slant. You'll go crazy if you look at it full on all the time. Put down the newspaper. Turn off the news. Put that cell phone someplace where you can't find it. Get off the internet. Not all the time. We need to know what's going on. You need to know what's going on so that you could act reasonably, thoughtfully, intelligently. You need to be motivated to act. But look at the world slantwise. That is, there are other things in this world other than the doom and gloom of the political scene, which is the source of the courage and inspiration that we need. That's where you will find it. I just want to conclude with slantwise from this whole talk. 3 everyday, simple practices that I think are important for every one of us. 1, Pay attention to goodbyes. Whenever you leave someone that you care about, make sure that you say goodbye properly. Mean it. You don't know when or if you will ever see them again. 2, check in on a regular basis with those who matter to you. Pick up a phone, knock on a door, pay a visit, take a walk together, go out to a restaurant together, do something. Check in on a regular basis with all those who matter to you. And today, with Zoom and the internet and FaceTime and whatever we have, there's no excuse, no matter where somebody lives, for us to lose touch. And third, be attentive to strangers. Pay attention to the person who's standing in front of you on the checkout line, the person who is packing your bags, the person who may be behind you when you're entering a building and you keep the door open for them, to smile at strangers as you pass them on the street. Be attentive to strangers. We, in fact, are strangers to almost everybody else in this world. No one wants to be invisible.